You might be thinking, how could someone like Thomas, who appeared so polished and professional, flip a plate over at a family gathering? Well, it was shocking for me too. As I stood there, amidst the scattered pieces of food and the hushed murmurs of our relatives, I couldn't help but wonder how it all came to this. The day began ordinarily enough. I remember waking up early, excited to host our first large family gathering since our wedding. I planned to cook Thomas's favorite dishes, as well as some new recipes I thought would impress the extended family. Cooking isn't really my forte, but I wanted to make an effort to show that I cared about my new role as a wife, even though deep down, I missed my job terribly. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed indifferent from the morning. He barely touched his breakfast and seemed lost in thought, probably about work. He always had a lot on his mind, being a consultant at a major firm. I tried to engage him, asking about his preferences for the table setting or the food, but he just nodded absent-mindedly. Hours later, as everyone gathered around the table, laden with dishes I had spent all day preparing, the atmosphere was initially warm. Laughter and conversation filled the room. It was just as I had hoped. But then, Thomas took that one bite, and his demeanor shifted drastically. His face contorted with dissatisfaction, and without warning, he flipped the plate. The room fell silent. "Why would you serve this on such an occasion?" Thomas's words cut through the silence like a knife. Everyone stared, some in disbelief, others in discomfort. As he continued ranting, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. This wasn't just about the food, it was about me not meeting his expectations, not just today, but every day since I had left my job. The job I loved, the job I was good at, which I had left to fulfill his wish of having a stay-at-home wife. It wasn't me. I finally spoke up, my voice steady, despite the tremor I felt inside. "I didn't cook today." I watched as his face went from angry to confused. Yes, I had planned to cook, but at the last minute, I had to order in because I received a call from a former colleague needing urgent help with a project, a reminder of the life I had before. Now, with everyone's eyes on me, I realized this was my moment. I needed to stand up for myself, to reclaim some part of the identity I had before Thomas. I had always been more than just his support system or someone to manage his home. I was a professional, a friend, and someone with dreams and aspirations. Taking a deep breath, I looked around at our relatives, then back at Thomas. "I'm not just your wife," I said, my voice clear and confident. "I am Sarah Mitchell, and I have my own worth beyond this household." In that moment, I didn't just stand up for myself. I took the first step toward finding a balance between the life I once loved and the one I was learning to navigate. Have more control over our lives. This realization struck me profoundly as the days turned into weeks and then months. Living the life of a weekend wife, I found myself looking forward to the brief weekends when Thomas would be home, but even those days weren't as joyful as I imagined they would be. Each Friday, I would feel a mix of anticipation and anxiety. I would clean the house meticulously, cook his favorite dishes, and try to create a welcoming environment, hoping to capture some semblance of the life we had promised each other. But the reality was often different. Thomas would arrive home, tired and preoccupied, barely acknowledging the efforts I had put in to make everything perfect. Our conversations were superficial, mostly revolving around his work or trivial matters. It was as if we were slowly turning into strangers living parallel lives under the same roof. This arrangement made me question the essence of our marriage. Was it just convenience for him? A place to return to when he needed rest or a break from his bustling professional life? It seemed that his commitment to his job was his priority, and our marriage, a secondary arrangement that needed to fit around his career. It dawned on me that in his view, my role was to support this structure silently, without complaint. As I mulled over these thoughts, a part of me felt deeply lonely. The house felt too big, too empty, and the silence too loud. I missed the companionship, the shared daily experiences that I believed marriage would bring. I missed discussing my day with someone who cared, cooking together, and even arguing over small, inconsequential things. These everyday interactions, which I once thought mundane, now seemed like a luxury. I began to fill my days with activities to distract myself from this loneliness. I joined a local community center, started attending cooking classes, and even considered part-time consultancy work in my old field. Each new activity brought a small sense of fulfillment and a break from the echoing quiet of the house. One weekend, when Thomas came home, he noticed the change. He saw the new plants lining the windowsill, the art supplies in the corner of the living room, and the stack of consultancy papers on the dining table. "What's all this?" he asked, a hint of confusion in his tone. "I've been keeping busy," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Exploring old interests and discovering new ones." He looked around, seemingly trying to reconcile with the changes in the home and, subtly, in me. I could tell he was surprised, maybe even a bit unsettled, that I was finding ways to be happy without him. "Looks like you've been enjoying yourself," he said, trying to sound supportive, but I could detect a trace of discomfort. "Yes, I have," I admitted, realizing in that moment how true those words were. This self-discovery, born out of necessity, was unintentionally becoming my way out of the shadows of our weekend-only marriage. As I stood there, watching his reaction, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for me, one where I could perhaps find a balance between the love I had for Thomas and the love I was rediscovering for myself. Hearing her voice was unexpected, almost jarring against the backdrop of the silent, near-empty house. She sounded concerned, her words tinged with urgency. "Sarah, I've been trying to reach Thomas for days now. He's not answering my calls or texts. Is everything okay between you two?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Oh, we're managing," I replied carefully, my voice neutral. "Thomas has been very busy with work, and he's not often home. Maybe he missed your messages." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her processing my words. "I see," she finally said, her tone shifting slightly. "But that's just it, Sarah. His office called me. They said he hasn't been in for a week. They're worried." A knot formed in my stomach. Thomas hadn't been home much, but I assumed his absences were due to his work. The thought that he might be lying about his whereabouts added a new layer of anxiety and confusion to the mix. Why would he disappear from his job without telling anyone? "Thank you for letting me know," I managed to say, my mind racing. "I'll try to find out what's going on and get back to you." After we hung up, 1,000 thoughts whirled through my head. Where could Thomas be? Was he okay? Was there another reason for his absence? The uncertainty was maddening. I decided to call his closest friend, hoping for some insight. The friend seemed surprised to hear from me, but was equally in the dark about Thomas's whereabouts. Feeling more alone than ever, I realized I needed to take action. I couldn't keep waiting for Thomas to provide stability and honesty. It was time to seek answers on my own. I started by visiting his office. The receptionist recognized me, and her face fell when I asked about Thomas. "He hasn't been here in a while," she confirmed, her voice low. "We thought he was on a long business trip." The pieces weren't adding up. There was no business trip that I knew of, and his sudden disappearance from work was alarming. I thanked her and walked out, my mind numb. What was Thomas hiding? Was our entire relationship built on deceit? I felt betrayed, not just by the potential lies, but by my own willingness to turn a blind eye to the signs that something was wrong. Determined to uncover the truth, I went back to our home and began digging deeper. I checked bank statements, emails, anything that might give me a clue to his whereabouts or activities. With each discovery, the picture grew increasingly troubling. Large sums of money transferred to unknown accounts, strange names and numbers, and hotel bookings in cities Thomas had no reason to visit. It was as if I was married to a stranger. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, I sat surrounded by papers and digital trails, a sense of dread settling over me. My marriage, it seemed, was a facade, and the man I thought I knew was a mystery. This wasn't just about a weekend marriage anymore. It was about discovering who Thomas really was and deciding how I would navigate a future that was suddenly as unclear as the motives of the man I married. Feeling a mixture of rejection and resolve, I hung up the phone, the harsh tone of my mother-in-law's voice still ringing in my ears. The conversation had not gone as I hoped. I had wanted some understanding, perhaps even an ally in navigating my crumbling marriage, but instead, I faced skepticism and accusation. It stung, realizing that even with the best intentions, I was still viewed as the outsider, the one at fault. Alone in the quiet of our house, the walls seemed to close in on me. The echoes of Thomas's lies reverberated through the empty rooms. It was clear that he had painted a picture of our marriage to his mother that was completely detached from reality. A part of me wondered how long he could maintain this facade, and what would happen when it finally crumbled. With Christmas approaching, I knew the family gathering would be an opportunity to see Thomas, perhaps even confront him in person about his actions and the divide between his words and reality. It would also be a chance to observe the dynamics of his family more closely, to understand why his mother held such unwavering support for her son, despite evidence to the contrary. As the days passed, my resolve strengthened. I decided to gather evidence of Thomas's comings and goings, or rather, his absences. I installed a small security camera that covered the front door and kept a detailed log of the days and times he was actually home. It wasn't something I took any pleasure in, it felt more like a necessity, a way to protect myself from further accusations and to perhaps someday show his family the truth. I also reached out to a few friends who knew both Thomas and me. I needed support, someone to talk to who might understand or at least listen without judgment. Their reactions were mixed, some were shocked, others not so much, having perhaps seen signs of Thomas's behavior that I had missed. As Christmas drew near, I prepared myself mentally for the family gathering. I knew it would not be easy. The air would likely be filled with festive cheer on the surface, but beneath, tensions would simmer, especially between me and Thomas's mother. I packed the camera footage on a USB drive, tucked securely in my purse, not sure if I would use it but feeling empowered by its mere presence. The drive to my in-laws' house was a quiet one, filled with apprehension and a sense of inevitability. Upon arriving, I was greeted with superficial warmth. Thomas was there, his demeanor cool and composed as if our strained phone calls and his prolonged absences were just figments of my imagination. Throughout the evening, I watched and waited, looking for the right moment to perhaps bridge the gap with my mother-in-law or confront Thomas. But as the night wore on, with laughter and the clinking of glasses around me, I felt more like an observer than a participant in this family scene. At that moment, it became clear that the challenge ahead was not just about proving my truth, but deciding how I would navigate this complicated web of relationships and my own path forward. Whether Thomas or his family ever came to see my side, I knew I needed to find a way to live authentically, not just in their eyes, but in my own. As the silence stretched taut after Thomas's outburst, the room filled with uneasy glances and murmured whispers among the relatives. My cheeks burned with humiliation, but inside, my resolve hardened. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment to put my plan into action, albeit in a way that maintained dignity amidst chaos. Turning to Thomas, I kept my voice calm, despite the storm raging within me. "I didn't make the dish, Thomas," I stated clearly, ensuring every relative could hear. The room fell even quieter, the tension almost palpable. Thomas, caught off guard, blinked in confusion. His mother, who had been quick to criticize me in the past, looked from me to Thomas, trying to gauge the situation. The housemaid, who had been in the background, paused in her work, her eyes behind her glasses watching the drama unfold. I had spoken with her earlier, one of the few alliances I had formed in preparation for today. She knew the truth of the situation, having actually prepared the dish herself under my instruction to ensure everything went perfectly for the gathering. Thomas's uncle, who had always seemed indifferent, now showed a flicker of interest, his eyes sharp. "Thomas, if Sarah didn't cook, then why blame her?" he asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. It was a simple question, yet it shifted the dynamic, drawing attention to Thomas's unreasonable behavior. My mother-in-law, now visibly conflicted, glanced between her son and me. "Thomas, you should apologize. It's Christmas, and no way to treat anyone," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it directed towards me. It seemed the public nature of Thomas's humiliation of me had tipped the scales, even if slightly. Thomas, red-faced and flustered, mumbled something unintelligible under his breath, not quite an apology but a retreat from his earlier aggression. I could see in his eyes a flicker of the realization that he had overstepped, that his usual tactics hadn't worked with an audience. Seizing the opportunity, I addressed the room, my voice steady but warm. "Let's not let this spoil our Christmas. I'm sure everyone put a lot of effort into being here together, and it's supposed to be a day of joy and forgiveness." As I spoke, I met the eyes of each family member, including the quiet housemaid, whose slight nod gave me a sliver of encouragement. My father-in-law put down his newspaper, his gaze meeting mine for a fleeting moment with what I hoped was a spark of understanding or perhaps approval. From that point, the dinner resumed with a strained but improved atmosphere. Conversations tentatively restarted, focusing on lighter topics, the usual holiday banter. I participated where necessary, but my thoughts were already ahead, planning my next steps after this revelation. Though today had been about proving a point, about showing that I was not the person Thomas or his mother portrayed me to be, it was also a turning point for me personally. I had stood up for myself publicly, and whatever the outcome, I knew this was just the beginning of a larger change I needed to make in my life, with or without Thomas. This Christmas might have started with conflict, but it ended with a sense of empowerment, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope about my future. As the truth unfolded before the gathered relatives, a sense of disbelief seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. My mother, who had been masquerading as the housekeeper, now stood revealed in her true identity, her expression a mix of determination and apprehension. Thomas, usually so quick with his retorts, now stood silent, his face drained of color. The realization of his deception, of the web of lies he had spun, seemed to weigh heavily on him. His eyes flickered nervously between me, my mother, and the other guests, as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. My parents-in-law, who had been so quick to defend Thomas in the past, now stared at him with a mixture of shock and disappointment. The realization that their son had been lying to them, manipulating the truth to suit his own agenda, must have been a bitter pill to swallow. For me, standing there amidst the unfolding drama, there was a strange sense of liberation. I had spent so long feeling trapped in Thomas's web of deceit, questioning my own worth and validity in the face of his accusations. Now, with the truth laid bare for all to see, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. "I think it's time we had a frank discussion," I said, my voice steady despite the roiling emotions inside me. "Thomas, you've been deceiving not just me, but your own family as well. It's time to come clean and face the consequences of your actions." Thomas opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His facade of confidence seemed to crumble before my eyes, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. My mother-in-law, her eyes shining with unshed tears, reached out to me, her expression softened by understanding. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. We had no idea." "I had no idea," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude for her acknowledgement. It wasn't the resolution I had expected, but it was a start, a recognition that the truth, no matter how painful, was better than living a lie. As the evening wore on, conversations shifted, tensions eased, and slowly, a sense of normalcy returned to the gathering. But beneath the surface, I knew that everything had changed. The facade of Thomas's perfect marriage had been shattered, revealing the cracks beneath. In the days and weeks that followed, there would be difficult conversations, painful truths, and perhaps even more revelations. But for now, in this moment of clarity and honesty, I allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that I had finally taken a stand for myself and the life I deserved. As the murmurs in the room grew into a storm of disbelief, I stood with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding around me. My voice cut through the clamor as I continued, "I suppose this might come as a surprise to you, Thomas, as well as to everyone else here." I swept my gaze over the shocked faces of his relatives. They clutched their pearls and adjusted their glasses, trying to process the unfolding drama. "I've endured much since we declared our vows, vows that seem only to bind me and not you, Thomas. Each weekend, when you graced our home with your presence, I lived a partial marriage, a shadow of what I had hoped for. My tone was even, but the weight of my words hung heavily in the air. It was in these long weekday silences, in the stretches of solitude, that I realized something had to change. I turned slightly towards Mary, who still seemed puzzled by the reality crashing down around her. Mary, I don't blame you. This is not about you or me. This is about a man who has failed both of us, weaving webs of deceit that have ensnared more than just his wife. I could feel Thomas's stare, burning with a mixture of anger and fear, but I held my ground. As you can see, Thomas, I said, turning back to face him squarely, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And today, it seems, the truth wants to be heard. His mother, previously so vociferous in her defense, was now silent, her face a mask of consternation and denial. I can't believe my Thomas would do such things, she whispered to the relative beside her, but the conviction was gone from her voice. The room felt charged, a brewing storm of revelation that threatened to sweep through the house and cleanse it of the pretenses under which it had long operated. Thomas attempted to speak, his voice a blend of desperation and incredulity. This is some mistake, I can explain everything, he stuttered, his eyes darting around, seeking an ally in a sea of skeptics. But before he could construct his defense, another voice chimed in, Uncle John, always the peacemaker, yet his tone now carried an edge of disappointment. Thomas, we've seen enough. We've heard enough. It's time you own up to your actions and face the consequences like a man. The family's eyes turned towards Thomas, waiting for his response, for his confession, for any sign of remorse. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, it became painfully clear that Thomas was still scrambling for an escape route from the truth laid bare. The tension was palpable, a living entity in the room, as we all waited for what would come next. As the weight of the detective's report sank in, silence descended upon the room, broken only by the soft rustling of papers as I displayed each damning document. Thomas and Mary's expressions mirrored each other, a mixture of disbelief and horror. The evidence was irrefutable, detailing dates, places, and intimate conversations between them that stretched back years. As I flipped through the photos and messages, each piece felt like a betrayal, yet there was a strange relief in laying it all bare. Thomas, his voice a mere whisper, tried to interject. This isn't what it looks like. It's not. Enough, Thomas, I cut him off sharply. We're beyond excuses now. The truth is here, in black and white. I gestured to the stack of papers. Your late nights, the weekends away, your so-called business trips. It's all here. The relatives, previously buzzing with whispers and murmurs, now watched in stunned silence. Their eyes darted between Thomas, the papers, and me, as if trying to reconcile the man they knew with the evidence of his deceit. My father-in-law, a stern man who had always been distant but respectful, finally spoke. His voice was cold, devoid of the warmth I had occasionally seen during family gatherings. Thomas, you've not only deceived your wife, but you've disgraced our family. We raised you better than this. My mother-in-law, whose defense of Thomas had been unwavering, now seemed smaller, her energy diminished by the weight of her son's actions. Her eyes, once fiery with indignation, now brimmed with tears of betrayal. She looked from the evidence to me, and then to her son, the realization dawning on her that her fierce maternal instinct had blinded her to the flaws in her own child. Mary, the young woman caught in the middle of this storm, seemed lost. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a dawning understanding of the situation. She glanced at Thomas with a look that was part betrayal, part dawning horror, as she realized the extent of the lies he had woven around both of us. I continued, my voice steady but not unkind. I wanted a marriage based on trust and partnership. What you chose, Thomas, was a facade, a weekend routine that allowed you to live a double life. I couldn't let this continue once I knew. Not just for my sake, but for honesty's sake. As the gravity of the situation settled over the room, Thomas stood frozen, his usual eloquence gone. His attempts to maintain a facade of innocence were futile in the face of overwhelming proof. The family, once so vibrant and lively during our gatherings, now looked at him with a mix of disappointment and anger. It was clear that things would never be the same. The revelation of Thomas's infidelity and the calculated deception had shattered not just our marriage, but the family's perception of him. As the reality of his double life was laid bare, everyone in the room had to confront the fact that the person they thought they knew was far different from the truth. Following the chaotic revelation and Thomas's hasty exit, the atmosphere in the room was heavy with the aftermath of scandal. Relatives stood or sat in stunned silence, processing the drama that had unfolded. My mother-in-law, her voice, barely audible amidst the quiet murmurs, finally broke the silence, her words tinged with regret and disbelief. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." I looked at her, feeling a mix of vindication and sadness. "It's okay," I replied softly, understanding that the deception was as much a shock to her as the confrontation was necessary for me. "I know this isn't easy for anyone." My eyes swept the room, catching glimpses of pity, shock, and even some whispered support among Thomas's relatives. It was clear that the image of the happy couple they had been fed was shattered. The truth, as ugly as it was, had liberated me from a facade that had become too painful to maintain. Taking a deep breath, I addressed the room. "Thank you all for being here today. I'm sorry for the scene, but it was something that couldn't be left in the shadows any longer." My voice, steady now, carried a quiet strength. "I believe it's best if I leave now." There were nods around the room, some murmured apologies for having doubted me, and expressions of support that hadn't been there when I first walked in. My mother, who had been by my side disguised as one of the maids, gave me a small, encouraging smile as we prepared to leave. We exited the house, leaving behind the tangled web of lies and deception. In the days that followed, I filed for divorce. It was a strange feeling, filling out those papers. Despite the short duration of our marriage, the ordeal felt like it had lasted a lifetime. The apartment we had shared was no longer a home but a reminder of the deception. Fortunately, the transition was smoother than I had anticipated. Thomas had left without a fight, overwhelmed by his own deceit and the consequences that followed. As I settled back into single life, the sense of relief was palpable. The divorced label seemed inconsequential compared to the freedom I regained. My return to the workforce was a breath of fresh air. I rejoined the condominium management company where I had worked before, and the familiar routine, the daily challenges, were invigorating. Working again, interacting with colleagues and clients, I felt a part of the world once more, a stark contrast to the isolation of my married life. It affirmed my resolve: if I were to ever consider marriage again, it would have to be under different terms, with a partner who respected and valued my independence as much as their own. Meanwhile, Thomas's situation had become precarious. His financial recklessness with Mary, coupled with the fallout from our public confrontation, left him in dire straits. Without support from his relatives, who were disillusioned and unwilling to aid him further, he had resorted to taking out a bank loan. The prospects of their planned marriage seemed bleak, with both sets of parents advocating for financial stability before any wedding bells could ring. Sitting in my renewed singlehood, the troubles of Thomas seemed distant, almost like they belonged to someone else's life. The contrast between my newfound contentment at work and his ongoing struggles was stark. I found peace in my daily life, content with the work I did, and the relationships I nurtured, freed from the shadows of deceit that had once loomed so large. Once upon a late summer in a bustling suburb, under the waning glow of the evening sun, there lived a woman named Eliza. She was known in her community for her infectious laugh that bubbled up like a clear spring and her keen eye for vintage trinkets, each piece in her collection holding a whisper of stories from the past. Her small, cozy home, shared with her husband James and his mother, Mrs. Waverly, was a treasure trove of these relics, each corner filled with memories and history. Eliza's life with James had started like a fairy tale, full of promise and love. However, as the years passed, the charm that had once drawn her to him began to fade, revealing a more sullen and petulant nature. His smile, which once warmed her heart, now seldom graced his lips, and their conversations, once filled with dreams and laughter, had dwindled to mundane exchanges. Mrs. Waverly, on the other hand, was a formidable presence in their home. A stern widow with a sharp tongue, she had a peculiar way of inserting herself into their affairs, often leaving a trail of tension in her wake. Her relationship with Eliza was polite on the surface, but fraught with unspoken grievances and simmering resentments. The dynamics in the house were always a bit strained but had reached a fragile equilibrium, until one fateful evening that set the wheels of change in motion. James came home that night with a look Eliza hadn't seen before. It was as if he had made a decision that weighed heavily on him, his usual indifference replaced by a twisted resolve. "Eliza, we need to talk," James began, avoiding her gaze as they sat at the dinner table, the remains of their meal forgotten between them. "What is it, James?" "You seem different," Eliza replied, trying to read his expression, a sense of unease growing within her. "It's about us, about our living situation. I've decided it's best if I move back in with Mother," he said, finally meeting her eyes, his voice steady but lacking confidence. Eliza felt a momentary pang of shock, not at the thought of losing the house or even their life together, but at the realization that she wasn't as devastated by his announcement as she thought she would be. A sly smile curled her lips, surprising even herself. "Very well, James. If that's what you wish," she responded, her voice calm and collected. "But know this, I won't be begging to stay. This house, your mother, it's all yours." James seemed taken aback by her lack of resistance, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "Are you sure? I thought you'd be more upset." Eliza stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "I've spent enough time in shadows, James. It's time for me to step into the light. Perhaps this is the change we both need." As she walked away, leaving James to digest her words, Eliza felt a surge of liberation. The house, once a symbol of their shared life, now felt like a chain she was all too happy to break. James and Mrs. Waverly, expecting to see a broken woman, watched in confusion as Eliza began to pack her belongings with a light step and a determination that seemed to fill the room with a new energy. Her departure marked the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely new. As Eliza closed the door behind her, the late summer air greeted her like a promise, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free to pursue her own happiness, unburdened by the expectations and disappointments of her past. The morning after James's announcement was a peculiar one in the house. Eliza woke to the first rays of dawn, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She had expected to feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, but instead, she felt a sense of liberation. As she packed her belongings, she moved not with the hurried pace of someone fleeing, but with the deliberate actions of someone choosing a new path. Her collection of vintage trinkets, each piece carefully wrapped and placed into boxes, seemed to whisper stories of the past and promises of the future. She paused now and then, holding a piece up to the light, letting the memories wash over her, then smiling softly before packing it away. James watched her from the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. "I thought you'd fight this, Eliza. Why are you so calm?" he asked, the edge in his voice betraying his attempt at indifference. Eliza turned to him, her gaze steady. "Because, James, sometimes the end of one thing is just the beginning of another. This house, our marriage, it's been over for a long time. You're just now catching up," she replied, her voice firm yet devoid of malice. Mrs. Waverly, ever the silent observer, interjected with a tone that suggested she knew better. "You'll regret this, Eliza. You're walking away from stability, from security." Eliza smiled, a genuine curve of her lips that reached her eyes. "Perhaps, but I'm walking towards happiness and freedom. Something tells me that's worth much more." The day progressed with Eliza methodically sorting through her life, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. James and Mrs. Waverly offered little help, their presence more of a reminder of why she was leaving than any assistance. When the movers arrived, Eliza directed them with a calm authority, ensuring her treasures were handled with care. The house felt increasingly empty with each box that left, not just of objects, but of the life and warmth Eliza had imbued it with. As the last box was loaded, Eliza took one final walk through the house. Each room echoed with memories, both sweet and sour, but she felt no sadness, only a sense of closure. Standing at the threshold, she turned to James and his mother. "I wish you both well," she said, not as a courtesy, but with genuine goodwill. "May you find the peace you're looking for." With that, she stepped out of the house, not as the woman they thought they knew, but as someone reborn, ready to embrace whatever came next. The air outside seemed fresher, the sky bluer, as if the world itself was acknowledging her new beginning. Eliza's departure marked the end of an era for the house on the suburban street, but for her, it was the dawn of something new and exciting. As she drove away, her heart was full, not of regret, but of anticipation for the adventures that lay ahead. In the weeks following Eliza's departure, the house seemed to undergo a transformation, but not for the better. What was once a sanctuary of warmth and love gradually became a cold, unwelcoming shell. James and Mrs. Waverly found themselves facing a myriad of problems, each more perplexing than the last. The first sign of trouble came with the pipes. One evening, as James attempted to wash the dishes, the sink gurgled ominously before spewing forth a torrent of murky water. "Not again," he muttered, frustration evident in his voice as he reached for the phone to call a plumber, something Eliza had somehow always managed to fix with her intuitive touch. "Mother, did you notice the water pressure has been odd lately?" James asked, hoping it was a temporary issue. Mrs. Waverly, who was trying to read in the living room, looked up, irritation creasing her brow. "Yes, and it's just another thing she left us to deal with." As if moving out wasn't enough, she cursed us with a crumbling house. But the water was just the beginning. The garden, once Eliza's pride and joy, turned wild and untamed, as if rebelling against its new caretakers. Weeds choked the once vibrant flowers, and the vegetable patch yielded nothing but withered plants. "Look at this mess," Mrs. Waverly lamented one morning as she surveyed the garden. "This garden used to be the talk of the neighborhood. Now, it's just an embarrassment." James, trying to untangle a particularly stubborn weed, sighed in agreement. "I don't understand. Eliza made it look so easy. I didn't think we'd have to do anything." As autumn approached, the house's demeanor grew colder. The heating system, which had always kept the home cozy and warm, now sputtered and wheezed, barely emitting any heat. Nights became a test of endurance, with James and his mother layering clothes and blankets just to sleep comfortably. "I can't believe this," James exclaimed one chilly evening, trying in vain to coax the ancient heater to life. "It's like the house is falling apart without her." "It's as if she took the life of the house with her when she left," Mrs. Waverly observed, a note of begrudging respect for Eliza's care of the home slipping through her usual stern demeanor. The true extent of the house's retaliation, however, was felt in the eerie atmosphere that now pervaded it. The walls, once resonant with laughter and conversation, now echoed with silence and the occasional inexplicable creak or groan, as if the house itself was mourning Eliza's absence. One night, as James lay awake in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, and the silence was oppressive. "Eliza," he whispered into the darkness, half hoping, half dreading she might answer. But the only response was the echo of his own voice, a stark reminder of the void Eliza's departure had left. James and Mrs. Waverly, once so eager to see her go, now found themselves longing for the warmth and care she had brought to their lives and the house. As they faced each new challenge, it became painfully clear that Eliza's influence on the home was far more profound than they had ever realized. Without her, the house was not just an empty shell, it was a reminder of what they had lost, not just a caretaker, but the heart of what had made it a home. In the weeks following Eliza's departure, the house on the suburban street began to show signs of distress. It wasn't just the unkempt garden or the accumulation of dust on surfaces once polished to a shine. There was a deeper, almost sentient, unrest within its walls. James and Mrs. Waverly, initially smug about their victory, started to notice the eerie changes. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, the silence between them was palpable. The house creaked and groaned around them, a symphony of discontent. "Have you noticed," James began, his voice barely above a whisper, "how cold it's become in here? Even with the heating on full blast. Mrs. Waverly nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Yes, and the lights. They flicker, even though we've had the wiring checked. The conversation turned to the garden, once Eliza's pride and joy, now a wild thicket that seemed to grow more unruly by the day. It's as if the house is rebelling against us, James mused, a hint of unease in his tone. The next day, as they attempted to address some of these issues, they found themselves thwarted at every turn. The plumber, after inspecting the groaning pipes, was baffled. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted. "It's as if the system is intentionally resisting repair." In the garden, tools would inexplicably go missing, and new plants refused to take root, wilting within days. It was during one of these futile attempts at gardening that Mrs. Waverly finally voiced what they had both been thinking. "It's her," she said, her voice laced with a mixture of awe and fear. "Eliza. She's haunting us, isn't she? With her absence." James, usually dismissive of such notions, found himself unable to refute the claim. The house, once vibrant and warm with Eliza's presence, now seemed to mourn her departure, its every creak and whisper a testament to her absence. One afternoon, as they sat in the increasingly dilapidated living room, James found an old photo album tucked away in a corner. Opening it, they were greeted by pictures of happier times, Eliza, laughing in the garden, Eliza, meticulously decorating the house for various celebrations, Eliza, the lifeblood of a home now turned against its current occupants. "It's as if she took the soul of the house with her when she left," James remarked, a note of regret in his voice. "And left us with a shell," Mrs. Waverly added, her usual stern demeanor softened by a rare show of emotion. That night, unable to sleep, James wandered the quiet halls, the echoes of his footsteps a stark reminder of what they had lost. Stopping in front of what used to be Eliza's craft room, he hesitated before pushing the door open. Inside, the remnants of her projects lay scattered, untouched since her departure. It was here, surrounded by the ghosts of Eliza's passions, that James finally understood the depth of his mistake. Eliza hadn't just been a part of their lives, she had been the cornerstone of their home. Her revenge, James realized, was not an act of spite but a lesson in value. By withdrawing her presence, she had shown them the true worth of what they had taken for granted. The house, with its groaning pipes and wild garden, was not just rebelling, it was mourning. In the quiet of the night, James whispered an apology into the darkness, knowing it was too late for regrets but hoping, somehow, it would bring some peace to the restless home. Eliza's sly revenge was complete, not through dramatic actions, but through the profound realization of her absence. James and Mrs. Waverly were left to confront the emptiness she had left behind, a reminder of the cost of their actions. In her new home, a quaint and luminous apartment nestled in the heart of a vibrant neighborhood, Eliza found the fresh start she had longed for. The space was smaller, yet every corner was imbued with her essence, filled with the vintage treasures and memories she cherished. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could rebuild and redefine her life on her own terms. As days turned into weeks, Eliza immersed herself in her passions. She began refurbishing vintage furniture, turning worn pieces into works of art. Her apartment slowly transformed into a gallery of her talents, each piece telling a story of transformation and renewal. One evening, as she put the finishing touches on a particularly stubborn chair, her friend Clara stopped by. Clara, with her keen eye for design and unwavering support, had been Eliza's confidant through the tumultuous times. "This place, it's incredible, Eliza," Clara remarked, her eyes scanning the room. "It's so you. Vibrant, warm, and utterly inviting." Eliza smiled, wiping her hands on a cloth. "It feels right, doesn't it? I think, for the first time in a long time, I'm exactly where I need to be." Clara nodded, picking up a photo frame from a nearby table. It was a picture of Eliza in her new apartment, surrounded by her projects. "You've grown so much, Liz. It's like you've blossomed into the person you were always meant to be." The conversation drifted to Eliza's newfound independence. "I never realized how much of myself I had lost, trying to fit into a life that wasn't mine," Eliza confessed. "Leaving, it was terrifying, but it was also the most liberating decision I've ever made." Clara squeezed her hand. "You've always had this incredible strength, Eliza. You just needed a chance to see it for yourself." Their discussion turned reflective as they pondered the journey of self-discovery. "Do you think they've noticed?" Eliza mused, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "James and his mother, do you think they understand what they've lost?" Clara's response was thoughtful. "Maybe, maybe not. But you know what? It doesn't matter anymore. She gestured around the apartment, this is your life now. You're building something beautiful here, for yourself. That's all that counts." Eliza's evenings were no longer filled with the tension and unease that had marked her previous life. Instead, she hosted small gatherings, her apartment a beacon of warmth and creativity. Her friends, old and new, were drawn to her light, her infectious laugh once again a staple of her existence. One such gathering saw Eliza surrounded by laughter and lively conversation. Amid the festivities, she found a moment of quiet reflection. Looking around at the joy-filled room, she realized the truth in Clara's words. It didn't matter if James and Mrs. Waverly ever recognized what they had lost. Eliza had found herself, her passions reignited, her spirit unburdened. Her journey was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that growth often comes from the most unexpected places. Eliza had not only left a house, she had left behind a version of herself that no longer served her. In its place, she had discovered a strength and a joy that was entirely her own. As the night drew to a close, Eliza stood on her balcony, looking out at the city lights. The path ahead was hers to shape, filled with endless possibilities. She had faced her fears, embraced change, and emerged not just unscathed but vibrant and alive. "Here's to new beginnings," she whispered into the night, her heart full of hope and her eyes bright with the promise of tomorrow. Eliza's reflections of growth were not just about moving on from the past, but about stepping boldly into the future, ready to embrace whatever came her way with grace and resilience. The seasons changed, and with them, Eliza found her rhythm in the new life she had carved out for herself. The once empty apartment had become a home, its walls echoing with the sounds of her renewed joy and the vibrant gatherings that had become a regular part of her life. Eliza's journey had taught her the true meaning of moving on, not as an act of leaving something behind, but as an embrace of the future and all its potential. One crisp autumn morning, Eliza sat at her favorite coffee shop, a quaint little place she had discovered shortly after her move. It had become her sanctuary for reflection and planning. As she sipped her coffee, she couldn't help but overhear a conversation at the next table. A young woman was confiding in her friend about a difficult decision she faced, one that sounded all too familiar to Eliza. Without hesitating, Eliza turned to the young woman. "I couldn't help but overhear," she began, her voice gentle, "and I know it's none of my business, but sometimes, the hardest choices lead to the brightest paths." The young woman looked at her, initially surprised but then curious. "Did you go through something similar?" she asked. Eliza nodded, sharing a condensed version of her own story, how she had faced a seemingly insurmountable challenge and how, in choosing herself, she found a strength she never knew she had. "It's terrifying, stepping into the unknown," Eliza admitted, "but sometimes, it's the only way to truly find out who you are and what you're capable of." The young woman's friend chimed in, "It sounds like you've come a long way." "It's inspiring, really." Eliza smiled, a warmth spreading through her. "We all have our battles," she said, "but it's how we face them that defines us." Returning to her apartment later that day, Eliza found a letter in her mailbox. It was from James. Opening it with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, she found not the bitterness or accusations she might have expected, but an apology. "Dear Eliza," the letter began, "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on everything that happened, on how things ended between us. I realize now how much I took for granted, and for that, I am truly sorry. I hope you found the happiness you were seeking." Eliza sat down, the letter in her hands, and felt a profound sense of closure wash over her. It was the final step in moving on, a sign that the past was truly behind her. That evening, as she hosted a small dinner party, Eliza found herself sharing the story of the letter with her guests. It's funny, she mused, how life comes full circle. I never expected an apology, but now that it's here, I realize it's not just about forgiveness. It's about understanding, about growth. Her friend Clara, ever the voice of wisdom, raised her glass. To Eliza, she said, for showing us the true essence of moving on. It's not about forgetting the past, but about embracing the future with an open heart. The room echoed with the clink of glasses, and as Eliza looked around at the faces of her friends, she felt a deep, unwavering sense of contentment. Moving on had brought her here, to this moment of peace and fulfillment, surrounded by love and support. As the night drew to a close, Eliza stood on her balcony, looking up at the stars. She thought about the young woman in the coffee shop, about James, and about the winding path that had led her here. Moving on wasn't just an act of leaving something behind, it was a journey of discovery, of finding oneself amidst the chaos of change. Eliza realized then that her story was far from over. It was just beginning, and she was ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. With a heart full of gratitude and eyes open to the endless possibilities of the future, Eliza embraced the essence of moving on, knowing that the best was yet to come. I, Tala, have always known that John was different from anyone else I had ever met. Our initial connection in college was electrifying. He was driven, filled with ideas and plans for the future, while I was content to soak in the college experience at a leisurely pace. We met in a literature class where our interpretations often clashed, sparking lively debates that extended into late-night coffee sessions. John had this intensity about him, always planning, always pushing forward. I was drawn to his passion and his clear vision for a life outside the confines of his parental home. "Let's make a pact," he once said as we walked through the quiet college campus under a blanket of stars. "Let's promise to always chase what we want, no matter how hard it gets." His words were more than a youthful dream, they were a vow to himself, and somehow, I had become a part of that promise. After college, things moved quickly. John proposed during our graduation ceremony, pulling out a modest ring in front of our cheering friends. It was impulsive and perfectly John. Our marriage followed soon after, much to the disapproval of his parents. His mother, a stern woman with sharp eyes, made no effort to hide her disdain for me. She had envisioned a different life for John, one involving a woman of her choosing, someone who could fit seamlessly into their family's traditional mold. We moved into a small apartment, and John started a tech startup with some college friends. The days were long, and the nights often saw him slumped over his laptop, coding and recalculating his business moves. I supported him as best as I could, handling our modest household and working part-time at a local bookstore to add to our income. Our life was a far cry from his parents' well-ordered, comfortable existence, but it was ours, and it was real. His mother's coldness towards me never thawed. At family gatherings, her comments were thinly veiled criticisms, and she often reminded John of the life he could have had if he had made better choices. Despite this, our love remained strong, fortified by the challenges we faced together. However, the pressure was always there, a silent force gnawing at John's spirit. The day John took his own life was the day everything broke. The shock, the profound grief, and the sense of irrevocable loss were overwhelming. And yet, amidst this deep mourning, there was no respite from his family's harsh judgments. The funeral was the epitome of this enduring strain. His father tried to mediate, but the accusations from my mother-in-law cut through the somber atmosphere. "If he hadn't married you, he wouldn't have taken his own life," she hissed quietly as we stood by his graveside. The audacity of her blame was suffocating. I clenched my fists, holding back tears of rage and despair. All I wanted was to grieve my husband, my partner, but instead, I was defending myself against unjust accusations. After we left the funeral home, I collapsed into bed, hoping sleep would grant me a brief escape from the relentless pain. But the next morning brought no peace. The usual demand to fetch the newspaper was accompanied by a discovery, an envelope tucked inside, containing a message that promised yet another upheaval. The words written in John's unmistakable handwriting hinted at secrets he had kept, ones that could change everything. As I held the envelope, my heart raced with a mix of fear and determination. Whatever was inside, I knew it would set the course for what I needed to do next. As I held the small box with the ring, a surge of emotions flooded through me. My mind raced back to the very beginning, when John and I were just two college students with big dreams. Now, here he was, affirming our future together. "Of course," I said, my voice a mix of joy and resolve. "I've wanted this as much as you have." We celebrated our engagement quietly, with a few close friends who had been with us since our university days. That night, as we lay side by side, John shared more of his vision for the future. "With the company doing well, I think we can start planning for the next big step. Maybe look for a new place, somewhere we can really call our own," he suggested, his voice filled with excitement. The company had indeed become a significant part of our lives. John's passion project, the adoption website, had started to gain traction. He poured his heart into making the platform both informative and empathetic, providing a voice for those often unheard. "It's important," he would say, "that everyone involved gets to share their story. We need to give them a space to be heard." Despite the success, John often struggled with the pressure. His parents' disapproval of his career choices remained a heavy burden. "They still think I should have taken a real job, especially Mom," he confessed one evening, looking weary. "She doesn't see this as a stable future." The tension between maintaining his independence and pleasing his parents wore on him, sometimes leaving him gloomy and restless. Seeing him like this, I felt a deep resolve to support him unconditionally. "We'll get through this together," I assured him, holding his hand tightly. "You're doing something amazing, and I'm here for you, every step of the way." Our plans for the future were filled with potential and hope. We discussed moving to a bigger apartment, possibly starting a family, and expanding the company further. Each conversation built upon the last, weaving a tapestry of shared dreams and commitments. However, these dreams were tempered by the realities we faced. The night before our graduation, John finally confronted his parents with his success and our plans. To our relief, they began to understand the significance of what he had built. "I think they're starting to see the value in what I do," John said with a relieved smile after a long discussion with them. "It feels like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders." Now, standing in our kitchen with the engagement ring sparkling on my finger, I felt a wave of gratitude for the journey we had embarked on together. "Here's to us, and to a future we build on our own terms," John toasted, his voice steady and sure. Our life, intertwined between our personal love and our professional venture, blossomed. We were not only partners in life, but in business, facing each day with renewed determination and love. As we moved forward, our relationship deepened, fortified by the challenges we overcame and the successes we celebrated. Each step, each decision, brought us closer, weaving our lives together in ways we had always dreamed of. "John, could you please speak to your mother?" I asked, my voice tinged with a mix of bewilderment and irritation as she stood in our living room, uninvited and clearly upset about something. John's gaze flitted between me and his mother, a silent plea for patience evident in his eyes. "Mom, what's going on? Why didn't you call before coming over?" John's tone was gentle, yet firm, as he tried to balance respect for his mother with his loyalty to me, his new wife. His mother's face was a storm of emotions, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for something amiss. I needed to see where you were living now. This is all so sudden, John. You getting married, moving out. And with someone we hardly know." I watched the scene unfold, feeling a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just about her sudden visit or the lack of a prior phone call. There was an underlying tension, a palpable discomfort that seemed rooted in something deeper than the usual mother-in-law concerns. "Mom, we've talked about this," John said, his voice steady but his hands betraying his anxiety as they fidgeted with the edge of his shirt. "Tala is my wife now. We need to respect our space and our decisions." His mother sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly as she looked at me again, this time with a more measured gaze. I know. It's just hard to let go sometimes. But I'm here today, because there's something important we need to discuss." John and I exchanged a glance, a silent communication that crossed the space between us in an instant. Whatever was coming, we would face it together. "All right, Mom. Let's sit down and talk about it," John suggested, motioning towards the couch. We all took our seats, the air heavy with anticipation and the faint hum of the city outside barely audible through the closed windows. As she settled in, John's mother took a deep breath, her next words hanging in the balance as she gathered her thoughts. "It's about the family business," she began, her voice trailing off as if unsure how to continue. Enthusiasm hanging on her every word as she detailed her plans for expansion and innovation. John, sitting beside me, contributed a few strategic insights, which were quickly overshadowed by Jolie's more flamboyant proposals. I could feel his frustration as he tried to engage, only to be subtly sidelined. It was during these moments that I saw the weight of his silence, a resignation to his role in the family that seemed ingrained over years of similar occurrences. Despite this, he remained supportive of his sister, his pride in her achievements evident, even if it meant diminishing his own presence. Observing all this, I began to understand the family dynamics more clearly. The parents, particularly the father, showed a marked preference for Jolie, often praising her for initiatives and overlooking John's consistent contributions. This preferential treatment was not overt but displayed in little acknowledgments and affirmatives that accumulated into a significant bias. One afternoon, after a particularly tense discussion where John's ideas were dismissed once more, we found ourselves alone in the kitchen. John was quiet, his usual upbeat demeanor shadowed by the day's events. I reached out, placing my hand over his. "John, it must be tough, feeling like you're not being heard," I said softly, trying not to push him too much, but wanting to acknowledge his struggle. He sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry more than just frustration. "It's always been this way. Ever since we were kids, Jolie was always the star, and I was the support. I love her, I do, but sometimes, I just wish." He trailed off, not finishing his sentence, but he didn't have to. I understood. John wanted to be seen for his own merits, not just as a background to his sister's vibrant canvas. "John, I see you," I assured him, squeezing his hand gently. "I see how hard you work and how much you care. Maybe it's not acknowledged as it should be, but it doesn't go unnoticed by me." He smiled, a small but genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Tala. That means more than you might realize." As we prepared to face another day living under the same roof as his family, I knew our challenges were far from over. However, I was determined to be John's ally, to be his voice when he felt overshadowed and to ensure that, at least between us, there was recognition and respect. From then on, I took it upon myself to subtly highlight John's contributions during family conversations, making sure to draw attention to his ideas and praising his efforts. It was a small gesture, but it seemed to lift John's spirits, giving him a bit more confidence each day to assert his place in the family discourse. This new role I took on wasn't without its difficulties. Sometimes, my mother-in-law would cast me a wary glance, sensing the shift in dynamics. But as days passed, even she began to respond more positively to John, perhaps influenced by my persistent acknowledgement of his worth. Despite the complex family relationships and the underlying tensions, I held on to hope that, bit by bit, I could help bring about a change, not just for John's sake, but for the harmony of the family we were now irrevocably part of. Father-in-law, I felt a cold dread settle in. His actions were completely inappropriate, and the accusation from my mother-in-law was both absurd and hurtful. Trying to process it all, I realized the importance of handling this delicately, especially considering John's feelings and our relationship. Yet, the fear of further conflict with his parents made me hesitant to disclose everything to him immediately. "John, I'm really trying to adjust here, but it's more challenging than I expected," I confided, hoping to at least share some of my discomfort without revealing the full extent of the incident. "Your father, well, he's quite a character, and your mother's approach to things, it's quite different from what I'm used to." John's brow furrowed in concern. "I know it's been tough for you, especially with my mom. She can be overwhelming." And Dad, with his condition, it's a lot. Just remember, I'm here for you. We can figure this out together. I nodded, grateful for his support, but still carrying the weight of the secret I wasn't yet ready to share. Thank you, John. It means a lot to have your support. It's just a lot to take in, the dynamics here are complex. Later that day, while John was out, I found myself alone with his sister, Jolie. I decided it might be worthwhile to try and understand her perspective, especially given her close relationship with their parents. Jolie, can I ask you something? I ventured cautiously, not wanting to overstep, but desperate for insights. Of course, she replied, her tone open and seemingly genuine. How do you manage with everything here? The family dynamics, they seem quite intense. My question was vague, but I hoped it would encourage her to share her own experiences. Jolie paused, considering her words carefully. It's not always easy. Mom and Dad have their ways, and I've learned how to navigate that over the years. It takes time to get used to it, I guess. You're doing fine, though. Her response was diplomatic, offering little in the way of concrete advice, but confirming the complexity I had felt. It was somewhat comforting to know that even Jolie acknowledged the intense family dynamics. As the day drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the situation. The day's events and conversations had left me with a lot to consider. How would I navigate the tricky waters of this family life without losing myself or harming my relationship with John? It was a question that lingered as I prepared for another day, hoping for a resolution yet bracing for more challenges. To work at John's company? It was a question that lingered in my mind, mingling with a mix of suspicion and hope. Perhaps Jolie's decision was not merely about career opportunities, but something deeper, possibly linked to the ongoing tensions within the family. I want to be where I can make the most difference, Jolie explained later when we had a moment to talk privately. And right now, that's with John. He's been under a lot of pressure, not just from the business, but from our parents too. I think I can help ease that. Her words gave me a different perspective on her intentions. It wasn't just about professional aspirations, it was also about family dynamics and her role within them. Her decision to join John's company might indeed bring her closer to the daily issues he faced and provide him with support that he desperately needed but seldom received at home. The next morning, after John left for work early and our mother-in-law busied herself with her usual routines, Jolie pulled me aside. Listen, Tala, she began, her expression serious, I know things have been tough for you here, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to do more. But with me at the company, I'll be able to keep an eye on things more closely, not just for the business but for you and John as well. Her assurance was comforting, yet the gravity of our situation weighed heavily on me. The covert manipulation by my in-laws was more than a simple family disagreement, it was a calculated exertion of control, and now Jolie was positioning herself as an ally in a way I hadn't anticipated. Throughout the day, I busied myself with the tasks my mother-in-law had listed, my mind often drifting to Jolie's promise and what it might mean for our future. Her proactive approach to support us was a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere cultivated by her parents. By the time John came home that evening, I had managed to complete all the errands and prepare dinner, a small act of normalcy in the ongoing drama of our domestic life. John, noticing my fatigue, wrapped his arms around me in a quiet embrace. You look exhausted. Was today rough? He asked, concern lining his features. I nodded, leaning into his comfort. It's just been a long day, I replied, not yet ready to disclose everything. But Jolie and I had a good talk. She's really stepping up to support us. John's expression softened. I'm glad Jolie is there for you. We'll get through this, together, he reassured me, but the tension in his voice was palpable. He knew, as did I, that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, yet Jolie's unexpected solidarity offered a glimmer of hope. As we sat down to dinner, the future seemed slightly less daunting. Jolie's decision to work alongside John might bring new dynamics into play, potentially altering the balance of power within the family and at the business. Whatever her reasons, her involvement was now an integral part of our strategy to navigate the complex web of family politics we were caught in. "He's been struggling a lot lately," I began, my voice faltering as I recounted the recent events to my father. "His work has consumed him more than ever, and he's using sleeping pills to manage his stress. It's not like him, and I'm really worried." My father listened intently, his expression a mixture of concern and contemplation. "Work can sometimes be a refuge from personal issues," he said thoughtfully. "But it sounds like he might be avoiding dealing with something deeper. It's good that Jolie is there with him now." Nodding, I felt a surge of gratitude for Jolie's presence and support, but the anxiety about leaving John in such a state gnawed at me. "Yes, she's been incredibly supportive. They're not just siblings, they really look out for each other." The next day, as I helped prepare arrangements for my mother's funeral, my phone buzzed continuously with messages from Jolie, updating me on John's condition and the goings-on at the company. Her messages were reassuring, yet they couldn't completely ease the knot of worry in my stomach. "John's been quiet today, more withdrawn than usual," one message read. "I'm keeping a close eye on him, but he's really pushing himself too hard." I sighed, feeling helpless so far from home. The juxtaposition of dealing with my mother's sudden passing and worrying about my husband's deteriorating state left me emotionally stretched thin. Amidst the funeral preparations, I couldn't help but feel torn, my thoughts constantly drifting back to John. After the funeral, with many relatives still around, I took a moment for myself outside, the cool air providing a small relief from the overwhelming grief and stress. My phone rang, and Jolie's name flashed on the screen. "Tala, I just wanted to check in," Jolie's voice came through, slightly strained. "John's really not doing well. He hasn't slept much, and I'm starting to get really worried. He won't listen to me about taking a break. Thank you for letting me know, Jolie. Keep trying to get him to rest." "I'll be back as soon as I can," I responded, my mind racing with concern for John. "Of course," she replied. "And Tala, take the time you need there. We'll manage here. Just focus on your family now." Hanging up, I felt a mix of gratitude for Jolie's support and a deepening worry for John. It was clear that we both needed to be there for each other, but being pulled in two directions made it all the more difficult. As I walked back inside, I resolved to discuss everything with my father, hoping he could offer some wisdom on how to handle the dual crises unfolding in my life. But he wouldn't. I couldn't finish my sentence, the words catching in my throat as sobs began to overtake me. Jolie held me tight, her own tears mingling with mine as we stood in the stark, overly bright corridor of the hospital. "It doesn't make sense," I managed to choke out between sobs. "He was stressed, yes, but to think he'd—" "No, there has to be another explanation." Jolie nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know, Tala. I thought the same. But when I found him, it was just too late. The paramedics tried everything, but—" Her voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. We both knew the gravity of what had happened, but accepting it seemed impossible. The hospital's sterile smell and the distant sounds of medical equipment seemed to amplify the silence between us. After a few moments, we gathered ourselves enough to speak with the police officers who had been waiting patiently. They explained that they needed to talk to me about the circumstances leading up to John's death, to piece together his last days. "Mrs. Smith," one of the officers began, "we understand this is a difficult time, but any information about Mr. Smith's state of mind recently could be crucial." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "He was working very hard lately," I said. "He had been under a lot of pressure at work. And he was using sleeping pills to help him rest. But I never imagined he would." The words were hard to say, each one a weight on my heart. The officer nodded, taking notes. "Did he mention anything to you recently that might have indicated he was thinking about harming himself?" "No," I replied firmly. "He was tired, stressed from work, but suicide? He would have talked to me, or Jolie, or—" "This can't be right." The officers exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. "We'll need to investigate further, of course." His phone, his belongings, we'll need to go through everything to understand his actions. The reality of the situation hit me anew. John's privacy, our life together, would now be dissected in an attempt to find answers. I nodded, knowing it was necessary, yet dreading what they might or might not find. After the officers left, Jolie and I sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The echo of my earlier conversation with John played over in my mind. How he had insisted he was managing, how I had believed him. I should have seen it, I whispered, more to myself than to Jolie. You couldn't have known, Jolie replied gently. We all saw he was stressed, but we never thought. We couldn't have known this would happen. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Arrangements for John's affairs, speaking with his parents, who were in shock themselves, and the endless signatures and decisions that seemed so trivial now that he was gone. As the day turned to evening, the finality of John's absence settled over me like a heavy cloak. I was now left to navigate this new, unwanted reality without him, holding on to the fragments of our life together, trying to make sense of a senseless act. The pain was overwhelming, but Jolie's support and the need to find answers kept me grounded. We would find out why this had happened. We had to find it first. Curious and slightly apprehensive, I opened the envelope carefully, revealing several sheets of paper inside. They appeared to be copies of emails and medical reports. My hands trembled as I began to sift through the documents, each page potentially holding clues to the unbearable reality of John's sudden departure from this world. As I absorbed the content, the picture began to form, a chain of communications between John and his therapist, along with detailed notes from his last few sessions. It was clear from the therapist's observations that John had been deeply struggling with his mental health, feeling an overwhelming pressure that was much more intense than I had realized. There were mentions of unbearable expectations and escalating anxiety, which seemed to coincide with the mounting responsibilities at work and the constant tension at home. Sitting alone in the quiet of the early morning, I felt a profound sadness mixed with frustration. These documents painted a portrait of a man desperately seeking help, grappling with his thoughts and emotions in a battle that few knew he was fighting. Why hadn't he shared more of this with me? Could I have done more to help him? Lost in these thoughts, Jolie walked in, her eyes puffy from crying but alert. "What's that?" she asked, noticing the papers scattered around me. John's medical records and some emails from his therapist, I explained, handing her a few of the sheets. She scanned them quickly, her expression shifting from confusion to sorrow to anger. This explains so much," Jolie whispered, her voice cracking. "He was really suffering, wasn't he? And all this while, everyone just expected him to cope, to keep performing at work, to deal with everything at home." "Yes, it does," I replied, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "He felt trapped, Jolie. Trapped by his responsibilities, by his role in the family, by his own expectations of himself." We sat together, poring over the documents, discussing what we read, and trying to piece together the final days of John's life. It was a painful process, but it was also illuminating. We began to understand the depth of John's distress and the complexity of his thoughts and feelings during those last weeks. "I need to show these to his parents," Jolie said determinedly after a long silence. "They need to see what John was going through. Maybe then they'll understand it wasn't anyone's fault." "Not really." I nodded in agreement, though I doubted it would change their perspective. The blame had been placed, the judgments made. But perhaps, for our own peace and for John's memory, we needed to try to explain, to show the undeniable evidence of his inner turmoil. Gathering the documents, we prepared to confront his parents, armed with the truth about their son's struggles. It wouldn't bring John back, but maybe it could bring some understanding, some closure to the relentless cycle of blame and grief that had taken hold of the family. As we walked toward the house to face what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation, I felt a mix of dread and determination. This was necessary, not just for John's memory, but for all of us who were left behind, trying to make sense of a tragedy that had seemed senseless. We were ready to face the harsh truths, armed with nothing but the stark realities laid bare on paper. To handle this delicately, yes, but we also need to be direct and resolve these issues to prevent further harm. Jolie looked up, her eyes filled with a resolute fire that hadn't been there before. You're right, Tala. We need to confront Dad about the financial issues and the plans he had for the company. If John thought this was worth mentioning in his final letter, it's something we can't just ignore. We decided to gather more information before approaching her father. I started by contacting John's contacts in the company under the pretense of tying up loose ends on his projects. Meanwhile, Jolie agreed to discreetly look through financial records and correspondences in her father's office. Through our investigations, we pieced together a clearer picture. The company was indeed in a dire financial state, much worse than anyone outside the immediate family knew. Documents and emails hinted at desperate attempts to secure funding, with several risky deals that hadn't panned out. It appeared John's fears were justified, the company was on the brink, and his father had been banking on leveraging Jolie's upcoming role to stabilize it. Armed with this information, Jolie and I approached her father. We found him in his study, deep in thought over stacks of paperwork. His expression was weary, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. Dad, we need to talk about the company, Jolie started, her voice steady, despite the tremor I knew she felt. John left us some information, and we've confirmed it. The company's financial situation, it's critical. And your plans to transfer responsibilities to me, I need to understand why you thought that was the best course. Her father looked up, surprise evident on his face, quickly morphing into resignation. I was trying to protect our family, he began slowly, to keep everything we've worked for from falling apart. I thought if I could stabilize the company, everything would go back to normal. But at what cost, Dad? Jolie pressed, her voice firm. John felt so cornered by all this that he couldn't see any other way out. We can't keep going like this. The conversation that followed was long and difficult. Her father was defensive at first, but as we laid out the facts and expressed our own fears and hopes for the future, he began to see the situation from our perspective. It was clear that changes were needed, not just for the company's sake, but for the family's well-being. By the end of our discussion, we had agreed on a few critical steps. The company would undergo a transparent audit, and we would seek professional advice on restructuring. Jolie would still be involved, but not as a last-minute savior, a role she had never agreed to take on. Her father finally understood that the weight of his decisions had consequences far beyond financial statements. As Jolie and I left the study, I felt a cautious hope. The road ahead would be tough, but for the first time since John's passing, it seemed like we were taking steps in the right direction, not just to salvage a company, but to mend a family torn by secrets and burdens too great for any one person to bear alone. Spreading out some documents on the conference table. I think these will really help foster a more supportive environment here. We need to ensure that no one else feels overwhelmed like John did. I nodded, reviewing the proposals. They included new mental health initiatives, more flexible work hours, and an open-door policy with HR. These are solid, I replied, feeling a surge of pride. Implementing these will not only improve morale, but also help us honor John's memory in a way that makes a real difference. As we discussed the details, I realized how far we had come from those dark days. The office no longer felt oppressive, there was a new vibrancy to it, a sense of community that had been sorely lacking. Employees seemed more relaxed, and there was a noticeable increase in collaboration and open communication. In the following weeks, Jolie and I also established a wellness program that included regular check-ins with a therapist and workshops on stress management. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with many employees expressing gratitude for the changes. It was clear that while the path was not easy, it was the right one. One evening, as we were locking up the office, Jolie turned to me with a thoughtful look. "You know, I think John would have been really proud of what we're doing," she said softly. "It feels like we're finally moving in the right direction, not just in business, but in being the kind of people he always hoped we'd be." Her words resonated deeply. "Yes, I think so too," I responded, locking the door behind us. "It's not just about business success anymore. It's about people, about making sure they feel valued and supported. As we walked away from the building, I looked up at the stars, imagining John looking down on us. Despite the pain and the tumultuous journey, I felt a profound connection to his spirit, a guiding force as we navigated this new chapter. Back at our new home, Jolie and I continued discussing our plans for the future, both for the company and our personal lives. We talked about establishing a foundation in John's name to support mental health awareness and to help those in the corporate world cope with stress and pressure. Let's make sure his legacy isn't just about how he died, but how he lived and what we learned from him, Jolie suggested, and I wholeheartedly agreed. With each new policy we implemented, each decision made with compassion and foresight, I felt we were building something meaningful, something that would stand as a testament to John's life and our journey beyond the tragedy. As the weeks turned into months, the changes became more rooted, and the company's culture shifted perceptibly. It was becoming a place where people were genuinely happy to come to work, where they felt safe and appreciated, a legacy of John's vision, shaped by our hands. Living with Jolie, working together, and steering the company in a new direction, I felt a sense of fulfillment and purpose that I hadn't known before. John's absence would always be a void in our lives, but in living out his unfulfilled wishes, in honoring his memory through our actions, we found a way to keep his spirit alive and bring some peace to our hearts. I often thought of him, hoping that when we met again, I could tell him about all we had accomplished, not just in business, but in making his unseen dreams a reality. In the quiet moments, I would whisper. It was a typical Thursday evening at our place, nestled on the outskirts of a sprawling city. Tom and I had settled into our usual routine, him with a beer in hand, lounging on the couch after a long day at his auto repair shop, and me, Nora, eyes glued to my laptop tracking the latest stock and cryptocurrency trends. Our home, a cozy two-story we picked out for its promise of family and future, now felt more like a battleground for our increasingly divergent lives. "So, how was the market today?" Tom asked. His tone was casual, but I sensed the underlying tension. It had become our norm. "Same as always, ups and downs." "Crypto's looking good though," I replied, trying to keep the peace. Tom scoffed, setting his beer down with a little too much force. "Crypto, again? You know not everything that glitters is gold, Nora." I sighed, closing my laptop, bracing for the conversation we'd had countless times. "And not every car that comes into your shop is worth fixing, but you do it anyway, because you see the value in it." "Why can't you see the value in what I'm doing?" "Because cars are real, Nora. You can touch them, fix them, sell them. What you're doing, throwing our money at the wind hoping it'll fly back with more, it's just reckless." I felt the anger bubble up, the same old argument wearing thin. "Reckless? It's not reckless, Tom, it's calculated. There's a difference between gambling and investing. I wish you'd try to understand that." Tom stood up, pacing now. "Calculated? You call putting our hard-earned money into something as volatile as cryptocurrency calculated?" "Yes, I do, because I don't go in blind. I research, I study trends, I make informed decisions. It's no different from what you do with your shop. My shop is a sure thing, Nora. People always need car repairs, but this is just a phase. What happens when it crashes, huh? What then? We could lose money in any investment, Tom. The shop could falter. Nothing's guaranteed, but we've seen good returns on my investments. Isn't that worth something?" Tom stopped pacing, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "It's not just about the money, Nora. It's about security, about not risking everything on a damn coin flip. Why can't we invest more in the shop, expand it? That's a real, tangible way to grow our money. And put all our eggs in one basket? What if something happens to the shop?" "Tom, diversification is key, that's investing 101. He shook his head, the gap between our perspectives as vast as ever. "Diversification, sure, but into something stable, not this digital fairy dust." I stood up now, feeling the need to defend my choices, my independence. You know, for someone who runs his own business, you're surprisingly close-minded. And you're surprisingly stubborn, he shot back. All I'm saying is we could be using that money to build something lasting, something we can see and touch, not just numbers on a screen. The conversation was going nowhere, as usual. Let's just agree to disagree, okay? I won't criticize how you run your shop, and you don't criticize my investments. Tom sighed, the fight draining from him. Fine, but just remember, Nora, when all this blows up in your face, don't say I didn't warn you. The tension between Tom and me wasn't the only strain in our lives. His family dynamics added another layer of complexity. Living close to his parents and sister meant frequent interactions, each one a reminder of our different views on family and responsibility. It was a Sunday afternoon when Tom suggested we visit his parents. The idea alone made my stomach knot. It wasn't the parents I minded, it was Sarah, Tom's sister. Her lifestyle and choices were a constant source of bewilderment to me. Come on, Nora, it's been ages since we've seen them, and Mom's been asking about you. And, you know, Dad is fighting cancer, Tom pressed, noticing my hesitation. Yeah, I bet Sarah's missed me too, I muttered, my sarcasm not lost on Tom. Look, I know you two don't see eye to eye, but can't you just… I don't know, try for me? Sighing, I agreed. Fine, but I'm not staying if she starts on one of her shopping spree stories. We arrived to find Sarah already there, flaunting her latest designer bag. The air of superiority she carried like a perfume instantly grated on me. Look at this, just got it yesterday. Isn't it just fabulous? She gushed, barely acknowledging our presence. It's something, I managed to say, biting my tongue. Tom's mother, oblivious to the tension, ushered us in. Nora, dear, so glad you could make it. You two should visit more often. The afternoon dragged on with Sarah dominating the conversation, recounting her latest vacation and shopping exploits. I tried to keep a neutral face, engaging in minimal conversation, but my patience was wearing thin. So, Nora, still playing with your stocks and bits? Sarah smeared, her tone dripping with disdain. It's called investing, Sarah. You should try it sometime instead of blowing through money on things you don't need, I shot back, my annoyance breaking through. Tom shot me a warning look, but it was too late. Investing, please. Like gambling on the internet is anything to brag about. At least when I spend my money, I have something to show for it, she retorted. Something to show until it goes out of fashion next season, I retorted, unable to help myself. That's enough, both of you, Tom's father interjected, his tone stern. We're here to enjoy each other's company, not to argue about whatever this is. The rest of the visit passed in an uncomfortable silence. As we left, Tom couldn't hold back his frustration. Nora, why do you have to provoke her? Can't you just let it go for one afternoon? Me provoke her? She's the one who started it with her snide remarks. I'm just not going to sit there and take it, Tom. It's just, sometimes I wish you'd try a little harder for the sake of peace. Try harder, Tom? I'm not the one splurging on luxuries and then flaunting them in everyone's face. Why doesn't anyone tell her to stop acting like a spoiled brat? Because she's family, Nora. We look out for each other, even if we don't always agree with what they're doing. That's just it, Tom. Looking out for each other is one thing, but enabling bad behavior is another. There's a difference, and it's about time someone pointed it out to her. Tom sighed, the weariness evident in his voice. I know, but what can we do? She said in her ways, and Mom and Dad aren't going to change how they treat her. It's not just about Sarah, Tom. It's about us too. How are we supposed to plan for our future when there's always going to be this financial black hole in your family? We'll figure it out, Nora. We always do. The news hit us hard and fast. Tom's dad, Mr. Harrison, had lost his battle with cancer. It felt like one moment we were discussing treatment options, and the next we were plunged into mourning. Amidst the shock and grief, Sarah, Tom's sister, took charge of the funeral arrangements. It wasn't long before she dropped a bombshell on us about the cost. Sitting in our living room, looking like a storm cloud had settled over his head, Tom relayed what Sarah had told him. "Nora, Sarah says the funeral's going to cost $60,000. She's expecting us to chip in half." I nearly choked on my tea. $60,000, Tom? That's insane. Are we funding a funeral or a royal wedding here? Tom's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. Now's not the time, Nora. This isn't about the money, it's about giving my dad the send-off he deserves. But $60,000? There has to be a mistake. It's too much. Tom's voice rose, and I could see the vein in his forehead starting to pulse. My dad has just died, Nora, and here you are, haggling over pennies. What's wrong with you? I flinched at his harshness. I'm not haggling, Tom. I'm just shocked. We never even spent that kind of money on our own house. Tom stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You know what? I don't need this. I don't need you telling me what's too much for my own father's funeral. If you can't see past your damn spreadsheets for once, maybe you should just stay out of it. The hurt from his words cut deep, but I swallowed my retort. This was grief talking, not my Tom. I'm sorry, Tom. I'll transfer the $30,000 to Sarah. It's just, this is a lot to process. Tom paced the room, hands buried in his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd come to recognize over the years. Yeah, well, it's not just about the money, Nora. It's about doing right by him, and if that means paying whatever it costs, then so be it. When I confirmed the transfer to Sarah, Tom barely acknowledged it, lost in his own world of grief and anger. The distance between us felt like miles, not the few feet of our living room. Walking into the funeral agency, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. The last few days had been a blur of grief and confusion, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to learn. I'm here for Mr. Harrison's funeral, I announced to the woman behind the counter, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up from her computer, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're a day late. Mr. Harrison was cremated yesterday. My heart stopped. What? But how? I was told the funeral was today. She shook her head gently, her eyes full of sympathy. The family requested to move the date forward. I'm very sorry for your loss and the confusion, the woman at the funeral agency said, her words barely registering as I stood there dumbfounded. My mind was racing. How could Tom not tell me? Why was I left in the dark about such a significant change? Fuming, I dialed Tom's number, my fingers shaking with anger and disbelief. Tom, why the hell didn't you tell me the funeral was moved? I just showed up like an idiot only to find out I missed everything. Tom's voice was cold, detached. Because I didn't think you cared, Nora. All you've done is complain about the costs and question every decision. Why would I think you'd want to be there? Because he was my father-in-law. Because I'm your wife. How could you just exclude me like that? My voice cracked, a mixture of hurt and fury. Well, maybe not for long, he shot back, and I could almost hear the bitterness seeping through the phone. What's that supposed to mean? I demanded, my heart sinking. I'm done, Nora. I can't do this anymore. I can't be with someone who's so indifferent. You're more concerned with your bitcoins and shares than with this family. I've got the divorce papers ready. His words were like a slap in the face. Divorce? Was he serious? You're kidding, right? Over this, Tom? We can talk about it. We can work things out. No, Nora, it's too late. The house is going up for sale. We'll split everything and go our separate ways. That's it. I was speechless, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. Stunned, I wandered back to the parking lot, where I saw Sarah pulling in, driving a brand new luxury car. The sight of it made my blood boil. Nice car, Sarah. Where'd you get the money for this? Inheritance, she said, her smile not reaching her eyes as she tossed her hair back. Yeah, something like that. Dad left me a little something. The casual way she mentioned her father, shopping bags in her hands, and not a trace of sadness on her face, was infuriating. A little something, huh? Looks like morning is treating you pretty well. Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a smirk. Well, we all grieve in our own ways, don't we? Some of us invest in stocks, and some of us in cars. I clenched my fists, the injustice of it all burning inside me. This was all wrong. Tom and I were falling apart, and here was Sarah benefiting from the chaos. Enjoy the car, Sarah. Looks like it cost a pretty penny. Or should I say a pretty dollar, she laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the empty parking lot. Oh, Nora, always so concerned about the money. Don't worry, it's all been taken care of. I watched her walk away, her laughter lingering in the air. The man I loved wanted nothing to do with me, and the family I had tried to be a part of was showing their true colors. The days following the funeral felt like navigating through a thick fog of disbelief and betrayal. The weight of the divorce papers in my bag felt like carrying a boulder, a constant reminder of my crumbling marriage. But the sight of Sarah's new luxury car planted a seed of suspicion that I couldn't shake off. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to pay a visit to the funeral home, hoping to uncover some answers. Walking in, a mix of suspicion and determination fueled my steps. It felt surreal being here under these circumstances, but I needed answers. The place was quiet, the air filled with a solemnity fitting its purpose. At the reception, I recognized a face from the past, Jackie, a classmate from high school who'd ended up in the most unexpected of places. Jackie, I exclaimed, a bit too loudly for the setting. I didn't know you worked here. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face, before recognition set in. Nora. Wow, it's been ages. What brings you here? Something I can help with? I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation ahead. Yeah, actually, it's about my father-in-law's funeral. I heard it was arranged here. Jackie's expression turned professional, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. Sure, let me pull up the details. Give me a sec. As she typed away, I fidgeted, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The moment she found the record, her brows furrowed. Okay, here it is. The service was pretty standard. Cremation was requested, keeping things on the simpler side. The total came to $5,000. My heart sank. $5,000? But that's not what we were told. We paid $60,000, or at least we were led to believe that's what it cost. Jackie paused, her face a mask of concern. That's a huge difference. It was Sarah who handled the arrangements, right? Everything here was billed at $5,000, no more. The pieces were starting to fit together, a picture I didn't want to see. Can you print me a copy of that bill? I need proof. Sure thing, Jackie said, her tone sympathetic. She quickly printed out a duplicate of the check and handed it to me. Holding the paper, it felt like a piece of a puzzle that would unravel a bigger deception. Thanks, Jackie. I've got to sort this out. Armed with the printout from the funeral home, my next stop was confronting the family, particularly Sarah. The air felt heavy as I drove to my mother-in-law's house, where I knew they'd all be gathered, probably discussing the estate and the aftermath of the funeral. My stomach churned with a mix of dread and determination. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. I hesitated at the door, gathering my courage before stepping inside. The sound of my footsteps seemed to echo through the hallway, announcing my arrival. In the living room, Tom, Sarah, and my mother-in-law were seated, looking like a picture of mourning that was about to be shattered. My mother-in-law, her eyes shadowed with grief, broke the silence first. Dear, we missed you yesterday at the funeral. We thought you'd be there. Taking a deep breath, I replied, I was told it was today. I'm so sorry for your loss. My voice remained steady despite the churn of emotions inside me. Then, I turned to Tom. Can we talk in private? I hoped to spare his mother any more distress. Tom's response cut through the room. No secrets here. You're not part of this family anymore, remember? His words stung, but I pushed on, pulling up the check from the funeral home. Then explain this to me. The funeral cost $5,000, not the $60,000 Sarah claimed. Where did the rest go? Tom looked genuinely shocked, turning to Sarah with a bewildered expression. What's this about? Sarah squirmed under our gazes. I needed the money, she finally admitted, her voice small. The revelation seemed to hang in the air until Tom's mom, overhearing, added, "Your father saved for his own farewell. I even gave Sarah $10,000 more to cover everything." I did the math out loud, tension rising. $70,000 in total, and only $5,000 spent. Sarah, where's the rest? Flustered, Sarah confessed to splurging the money on a new car for herself, her gaze darting away, unable to meet mine. I expected Tom to explode, but instead, he almost tenderly told Sarah, "You shouldn't have done that. Be more careful next time." His response floored me. Careful? She committed fraud, Tom, and you're okay with that? Tom's justification left me reeling. You wouldn't understand. You've got no family. You don't get what it means to stick together. That was the last straw. In front of them all, I signed the divorce papers with a flourish. Sarah, you owe me $30,000. Pay up, or I'm going to the police. Tom's protests followed me out the door, but I didn't look back. I'd seen enough, heard enough. The betrayal was complete, and so was my resolve. As I walked away, the finality of my action settled in. There was no going back, only forward from here, away from the lies and the deceit that had marred what I once thought of as family. Packing up my life into boxes felt surreal, like I was an observer in my own story. The for sale sign outside the house was a stark reminder of the finality of it all. By afternoon, I was settling into a small apartment that felt more like a fresh start than a downgrade. That evening, as I was sorting through the remnants of my past life, my phone rang. Tom's name flashed on the screen, a name I no longer felt attached to. I answered, curiosity edging out resentment. Nora, you need to back off Sarah, Tom's voice came through, tinged with an uncharacteristic harshness. Back off? I laughed, cold and sharp. Not a chance, Tom. She took from me, and I want it back. Your sister is a thief. Tom was silent for a moment. She's family. You wouldn't understand. Family? I scoffed. That ship has sailed, Tom. As far as I'm concerned, you and your sister are just people I used to know. He tried to argue, but I cut him off. Save it. Sarah has 2 weeks to return my money, or I'm pressing charges. And you stay out of it. You're nothing to me now. Hanging up, I felt a mix of sadness and liberation. The man I once loved was now just another obstacle in my path to reclaiming my life. 2 weeks later, a knock at my door heralded the return of my $30,000. Sarah stood there, her posture defiant, a sneer playing on her lips. Here's your money, she spat, thrusting an envelope into my hands. Happy now, you money-grubbing witch? I took the envelope, my gaze steady. It's not about the money, Sarah. It's about principle, about not letting you walk all over people. She laughed, hollow and bitter. Whatever helps you sleep at night. As she turned to leave, I called out, just remember, Sarah, karma's a real pain. What goes around comes around. Closing the door, I felt a sense of closure. Leaning against the door, the envelope heavy in my hand, the money was a small victory. But the real win was standing up for myself, refusing to be a victim of their greed and lies. Life had found a new rhythm, calmer and more predictable, when out of the blue, my phone rang, displaying a number I hadn't seen in a while. It was Tom, a voice from a past I had neatly folded away. Hey, I need a favor. A big one, Tom's voice sounded more worn than I remembered. Favor, Tom? We're past favors. Don't you think? The suddenness of the call threw me. It's Sarah. She's in deep this time, Nora. Debt's up to her eyeballs, and the wolves are at the door. We've sold everything, the house, the shop. It's still not enough. His words took a moment to sink in. And you're calling me? Why? I'm not part of the circus anymore, Tom. He sighed, a sound of desperation. Come on, don't be like that. You got out, made it big with your trading. Can't you spare something for old time's sake? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything, he still saw me as a lifeline for their mess. Spare something for her? After she nearly ruined us with her lies? You've got some nerve, Tom. It's not just for her, it's for all of us. You wouldn't be where you are without me. Don't forget that. He countered, his voice edged with bitterness. A laugh, sharp and short, escaped me. Where I am is despite you, not because of you. You think I owe you? That's rich. There was silence on the line, heavy and uncomfortable. So, that's it then? You're going to turn your back on us? Us? There is no us, Tom. There hasn't been for a long time. And as for turning my back, I think you've got me confused with someone who still cares. Hanging up, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, yes, but also relief. That chapter of my life was truly closed. Now, sitting in the living room of my new house, a place I had earned with my sweat and smarts, I realized how far I had come. This was my sanctuary, built not on the shaky grounds of deceit and manipulation, but on my resilience